questioning is perhaps the greatest gift we have as human beings.
Science is more than a body of knowledge. It's a way of thinking.
It's a way of thinking that teaches us to question everything we think we know.
Science came about by developing techniques, methodologies for gaining reliable knowledge about the world.
We have at our fingertips the technologies that were only possible for the largest governments and corporations 20 years ago as an individual today.
If human civilization continued at anything remotely like the current pace of technology advancement for 1 million years, where would we be? I think we're either extinct or on a lot of planets.
The good thing about science is that it's true whether or not you believe in it.
We hold the scientific method in high regard because it works. If it stopped working, we'd throw it out.
Discover the past.
Create the future.
This is the Here and How podcast.
Welcome to the Here and How podcast, where every week we dive deep into big ideas to explore the past and create a brighter future. This is episode 10, Do We Have Free Will? I'm Stephen Woodford, also known as Rationality Rules, and with me is the tremendous Thomas Westbrook, also known as Holy Kool-Aid, and the razor-sharp Rachel Oates, known as Rachel Oates. So yeah, say hi guys, but you're ahead,
hi,
you
guys.
said hi.
Hi.
So first question for you both. Why are you participating within this conversation?
Because you forced me to.
Forced you to? There was full-on force.
You threatened my dog. And that's why she's crying next door right now, and it's not because I shut the door on her. It's all your fault.
That is entirely true. Yeah, this is not what I expected.
I'm doing it because I'm a pawn of the Illuminati and the Third World Order that's controlled by Satan and the reptilians.
I reckon we're gonna have people. They're gonna predict what Thomas's response will be. Like they hear the introduction, they go, right, pause. What is Thomas gonna say? Oh, it would be brilliant. That's great. So,
do they have any free will over that?
Well, that's the question that we're answering today, or attempting to answer. I personally think it's answered, but that's me declaring right now that as far as I'm going to try and be objective here, I'm quite biased. I've done a lot of research into this topic, and it is fascinating. It's one of my favorite topics of all times. But that I'm sure that will come through with my passion throughout. But you both aren't too well versed in this question as far as we spoke about before. So this will be a really interesting conversation to see how you both approach it.
I'm looking forward to it. It'll be good.
Yeah.
See if you can convince me one way or another.
Absolutely.
It'll be fun.
So let's really think about it. Why are you participating within this conversation?
I'd like to think I chose to be here, but also because it's my job and I made a commitment.
Yep.
And I like
to
live up to those commitments.
Yep. And why did you make the commitment?
Because you promised me money.
Did promise you money, indeed. It's interesting that the question is actually not easy to answer unless you thought about it, and that's actually the point.
Mm-hmm.
The reason that we do things, that we decide and choose to participate in conversations, to attend certain things or make certain purchases, is it all comes down to our wants, desires, interests, and needs. So if you need something, well, then you're going to be motivated to get it. If you're interested in something, well, then you're interested to have the conversation, to join me and Thomas in this case, to have this conversation, to be in this podcast. And the same is true of me. So it all comes down to wants, desires, interests, and needs. There's other words that we can use, but that's essentially what it comes down to.
What's the difference between a want and a desire?
The thing is that, there's several different definitions for all of these. And the reason I use all of them is just to kind of encapsulate all of them as an entirety. It's so what is a desire, for example? Is it a want to do something? Because we say, for example, we desire to have a chocolate bar. Well, we don't say that. We say we want one. But want and desire mean the same thing, if you see what I mean.
I think
and an interest is involved.
Are more emotionally driven than just wants.
Yeah. Yep, that's fine. I'm fine with that. That makes sense.
So if you say like he wants for nothing, doesn't that kind of more refer to like he needs nothing?
Yes, and again, it's like these words, they're so popular, and that means that they are going to have different definitions, and all of them, it's not too important what the definitions are. The point that's eminent at the foundation is that your choice to have this conversation, to eat certain food, to sleep, to whatever it is, it comes down to base axioms, if you will, and those axioms are just what you desire, what you're interested, what you need. Your cravings fall into it, exactly. So it all falls into this area. So you're like this consciousness on top, and you've got all of these things underneath. So
can I say that I have a craving to stay alive?
Yes, you can. Go for it. Why not?
An urge,
yeah. A need.
I kind of feel like living
you
today.
desire to. You're interested. Like they all work.
Yeah.
So the second question I have, and here's where things get a little interesting, is: did you choose to have the desire and interest to participate within this conversation?
I feel like I did.
Yes, you do.
At the same time, I think about it, like, let's say that a lion were to, like, just jump through the window right now.
Mm-hmm.
I don't really think that, like, in that moment that I would have a choice. That I think that I would either, run or, like, freeze, depending on how my brain reacts. A lot of people, like, when there's a fire or some natural disaster or terrorist attack, like, they'll just freeze in their tracks and kind of, like, look around to see what other people are doing.
Yep.
Until someone says run, or like jolts them from that. And a lot of people have actually, in studies of these types of behaviors have, they'll look at it like, why is this person just sitting there? Why are they like, and it's almost like there's this built-in reaction in some people to just like freeze or play dead, almost just kind of like hold still. Maybe it'll just pass them by.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of is a survival instinct a little bit.
No, it is.
It's like maybe if everyone else is like running and there's other motion, maybe like they won't target me.
Yeah, you get that a lot. Also, a lot of animals, if you stroke them a certain way or put pressure in a certain position, this is also true basically of hypnosis for humans. They enter a state of paralysis, and it's a survival mechanism. The predator will drop you because you're dead in its eyes.
Have you
and
seen
then
those fainting goats?
Yeah, they're famous for it, exactly.
Those are amazing.
Yeah. So when you're
like
scared,
spook them and they just stiffen up and like fall over.
Yeah. Exactly, and you've got like chicken hypnosis as well, where you hold a chicken's head to the ground if you're feeling particularly mean, and you stroke over the top of its beak, and it will just stop. It will be in a state of paralysis, and that's why it's a beneficial thing, evolutionary speaking. Once a fox thinks it's killed it, it will drop it and go for another one, and the drop is often enough to make it activate and run away.
That's smart.
Yeah, it is really smart. So your desires and your interest to have this conversation comes down to, like you said, financial gain, a good conversation, the fact that you're interested in these topics. Did you choose to be interested in this topic? Did you choose to find the conversation interesting? Because these are determining factors towards who you are as a person and the choices that you make. And the question is, do you need to be autonomous over these things in order to say that you have free will?
Well, I think too, like, you guys are, friends. And if let's say that every interaction that I have with you is you're just going after me and throwing me under the bus and treating me like garbage, then I'm not going to have the same neurological response when I'm around you, rather than my brain releasing like oxytocin and kind of building this trust connection, and rather than having like a little bit of dopamine of like anticipation and excitement over like, this is fun, I get to spend time with my friends, then instead, I'm going to have like stress hormones that are released, and so that's something I don't have control over.
Exactly.
I think
that's a very like, it's just kind of this, you can kind of, if you've read the book Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, he talks about how like you can have these emotional reactions that are really quick, and then you can kind of stop and think about things and ponder them and stuff. And I think where we're getting into with this podcast is we're going to question not just is the first reaction, do we have any actual control over it, but do we have any inherent control or just the illusion of a control over the second slow like thought process as well?
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah, this is exactly the path that this question delves into. Just on note of what you were saying about emotional responses, studies have shown that when we try to make a rational decision, say it's a mathematical equation or a logical inference, whatever it might be, when we're wired up to an EEG or fMRI scanner,
fMRI.
That's the one, sorry. I knew I got it wrong. You can tell by the way I said it slowly. I'm going to say it wrong later as well, because I've got to mention it again. But when they scan the brain, the emotional parts of the brain activate before the prefrontal cortex and where the rationality and the thinking happens. And that's interesting because it means that when we're considering decisions to have this conversation, to be whatever it is, or for the listeners to listen to us, you think that it's happening in real time in your consciousness, if that makes sense. But the evidence shows that it's happening in the emotional state beforehand. But I'm jumping way ahead of myself, so I have a third question for you. Has my questioning your desire and interest in this conversation reduced or increased your desire and interest in this conversation? And did you have a choice for it to do so?
Ooh.
Ooh.
Oh my god.
Inception.
I would say it increased. It increased because you piqued my interest.
Good. That's good.
And I could say that by piquing my interest, you sparked a couple things in me. Curiosity, I want to learn more. We want to, because there is a, just evolutionarily speaking, there's a survival advantage to being better equipped with better information and better knowledge. Like, where is the food and where are the predators and whatnot. So like we have kind of ingrained in us this desire to like know more and to figure out and to learn and discover. And I think also realizing that maybe I don't know this. Maybe there's something that, that I could gain. There's a financial incentive and in terms of like, let's say that down the road I go on some TV program and people ask me about free will and I'm completely uneducated about it and people like shame me and make me look stupid and I lose my place in society. But if I had tuned into this conversation right here, right now and learned all about it, then I wouldn't be in those boots. And so I think that there's kind of a million little triggers that are going off in the background that cause us to look into it. But if, let's say that you had approached it in a way of where I felt threatened and you're like, hey, Thomas, you're such an idiot. Like, you're so stupid. You don't know like all this stuff. You haven't read the things that I've read about free will. And I'm about to show the world how horrible you are. Then it's like, then my reaction might be a little different and be like, well, I did want to learn about it before, but now I just think that, Steve is a jerk.
Exactly. And the really interesting question is, do you choose for your emotional response to be that? And it's really peculiar. Just to add on to what you were just saying, by the way, a quote that I very much enjoy from Neil deGrasse Tyson. He was saying it to Dawkins, and I think I might have told you guys before. I may have mentioned it on the podcast before, but Dawkins was asked basically about his rhetoric and how he convinces people and how he uses facts, and he's quite callous towards emotional arguments. He's like, well, I don't care. This is what the facts are. It's quite a long time ago, and to be fair, Richard is still off that kind of ilk. And Neil deGrasse Tyson said, don't you think that if you want to make impact, if you want to convince someone, then you have to say, here are the facts, and here is a sensitivity to your state of mind. And it's only between them that you make impact. And that's why rhetoric is really important. So approaching someone and saying, listen, you don't have free will, or whatever it might be. It's not, or your religion's stupid, or you got that question wrong, or whatever it is. The fact that you approach it in that way, even if you're right, we all know this, of course, can just make you lose what you were actually trying to achieve. You wasn't actually trying to show that you were right, most people anyway. You're trying to convince the other person that they are wrong. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it comes down to that sensitivity of someone's state of mind.
This is actually one of the first things you kind of learn in marketing, is that the first thing to do is grab a person's attention with an emotional response. And most decisions, especially buying decisions, are made because of emotional reactions. And then people try and go back and rationalize their decision later and try and think it through logically and say, oh, well, I bought it because it was a good deal, because it was a buy one, get one free, it was this. But really, it was that emotional reaction that they had in the first place that made them act, that made them buy.
Exactly. Yeah. Marketing.
People do this a lot, too, with the religious beliefs that they come to, is they'll say, oh, I had this experience, I had this emotional feeling, I had this, this tremor, this collective effervescence, these goosebumps or whatever it is. And then that's kind of their turning point. But then you'll ask them, like, why do you believe? And they're like, oh, I believe in evidence, or, based off of evidence. You're like, okay, what evidence? And if you've ever watched any of the videos by Anthony Magnabosco, he uses the Socratic method, and he just asks people about why they believe what they believe. He calls it street epistemology. Mm-hmm. And when he's walking them through this process, just on the street with random strangers, he'll say, well, why do you believe this? And they're like, on evidence. And then he's like, what evidence? Well, this. Well, if someone showed that evidence was false, would you still believe it? Well, yes, of course. Well, okay, then that's not really based off of evidence. Like, is there something? Well, eventually you have to just take it on faith. Well, why do you have faith in this? Well, because I had an experience, I had a feeling.
Yeah.
And I think even if you have all of the facts on your side, there's a quote by Corrie ten Boom that she helped save people from the Holocaust, shelter Jews. And see, even as an atheist, I can quote religious people. But she has a quote that I'm pretty sure it's her that said, people don't care, or they don't care how much you know until they know how much you care.
Yeah,
and when you're able to kind of tap into the emotions and the feelings first and kind of bridge that gap, then they're much more open to kind of discussing the facts and opening up the rational part of their brain.
Well, I've always said when I make decision makings, I always kind of base them on my emotions and my gut feelings, and I try and like embrace that now. Like, you know, when we went to the shelter and they told us about Kyra, and me and Dan were a bit like, I'm not sure if she's right for us, but we'll meet her. And then we met her, and immediately we were just like in love with her. We knew she was the right dog. And I do that with a lot of things in my life. So, like, you know, quitting my full-time job on a whim, things like that. And I always find when I follow my gut instincts, it tends to work out for the best because it makes me happier in both the short and long term, you know. So while I might not be able to control my emotional responses to things, I think I definitely control whether I listen to them or not.
Okay, this is good.
Well,
this gets really.
Here's a question too: could you actually be a functioning member of society? I mean, at the same level that you are, if every single one of your decisions walked through all the ins and outs and pros and cons and whatnot? Like, let's say that you go clothes shopping.
Yeah.
And rather than going like, oh, I really like this dress. Well, why do you like it? It just feels right. Okay, well, what if instead of that, you're like, well, I took all the measurements and this one is like a half an inch better here and this one's like a half an inch off there, and like this color is more likely, like it has a 15% more likelier chance of, you know, getting people to notice me, and you know, for this one makes me look more professional in the workplace, and you know, you have to weigh those up and down, and then, you know, like if you're like, well, this has been, you know, trending as in the market as far as fashion goes for the last 3 years, so it's probably on the out, so I should probably look for something that's a little bit newer. And, you know, like if we did that with every single thing that we approach, like you'd barely be able to function.
Wait, what do you mean? You mean you don't do that?
Instead, we're like, does this make me look good? Like, does, you know, how do I feel about this? Is it comfortable?
Well,
like
an evolutionary response, isn't it? We've developed those quick emotional kind of gut feelings so that we can make quick judgments. You know.
And your brain might be processing a lot of those things, but you're not really aware of it.
We just know, oh, that makes me happy, or oh, that doesn't feel right.
So your consciousness isn't processing it, but your subconscious might, and you may be basically relying on your instincts, relying on expressions that you haven't actually consciously thought through, and that's fine because,
so
as you said, you just get paralysis if you don't. You can't choose to. It's just that's the way you've evolved. That's the way we function.
Steve may be aware of the fact that he's picking out an outfit because he saw someone in One Direction or one of the Jonas Brothers wearing it, but he doesn't realize it.
That's exactly the case. I don't realize it.
Oh, it looked good on them.
Hang on. You said Steve's aware. Did you say that he knows?
No, I said you may not be aware.
May not be aware.
I think I said.
You. Yeah, exactly. Oh no, you probably did.
If I said aware,
exactly.
Then I don't know.
No. I mean, you'll get grilled, I'm sure.
You know, people are going to be going back and rewinding now and listening.
Yeah, they will. Our one viewer is very good. Exactly.
I do sometimes, like, I'll be making a point and then I'll go back and I'm like, I said the wrong word. Do you guys ever do that?
All the time.
Oh, never.
And I don't think I have free will in that regard. I think sometimes, like, you just say stuff that
it came through.
It feels natural in a conversation, and so your mind stitches it together, but you weren't consciously deliberating on the exact word choice that you were going to use.
Exactly. So to move the conversation forward, I basically where we've just tapped into gets really into the heart of it. But I think to understand it properly, we need to have groundwork, and it's necessary groundwork. So, are you both aware of the main three schools of thought regarding free will?
No. But before we go any further, can I be really, like, annoying and ask what is, like, the definition of free will?
Ah, that's coming.
Oh, okay.
That's a great question. It's a really, to be honest with you, it's a really important question, and it falls into the schools of thought. They have a slightly different perspective on. Two of them agree on what to call it. One of them doesn't, and they have different positions in relation to it. So, if you want, I can explain them. And I mean, I've got to anyway. Otherwise, this would be a bad conversation. But
I'm gonna say. Determinism, compatibilism, and is it libertarianism?
Yes, correct. So they are the three schools.
This.
Cool,
okay,
excellent.
But I don't know much, so go ahead.
Well, I'm going to recap it for you guys and, of course, for the listeners. So libertarianism is defined as the position that humans have the ability to choose, think, and act without being determined by prior causes. So it's a traditional religious kind of perspective in the sense that, you know, you really are responsible for your actions.
So would that be the notion that, like, if I could go back now, I would have done it differently, even with like all the same inputs and all the same knowledge that you had then?
Yep, that is libertarian free will. It is that there is some kind of ghost in the machine, essentially. That your consciousness, you can act despite all of the factors around you. There is a real freedom to it. That's the position, and it's necessary for a lot of religions to function. And it also, really importantly, libertarian free will is what we all have the illusion of having. Either we have it or it's an illusion, because we all feel that way. Even when you're conscious of it, it's like if I hold up a bit of paper to you and there's an illusion on it, there is an optical illusion, it's moving. You may or may not, depending on your age and your intelligence, be able to figure out whether or not it's actually moving. But you don't get a choice in seeing it as moving. That's how libertarian free will works, at the very least. And that is that I feel like I'm having a conversation with you now. I feel like I'm choosing to think and act without prior causes determining me. I don't, however, intellectually think that's the case, but I cannot help but have that illusion. But yeah, this is a really heavy conversation, but it is fascinating. So moving on, determinism is defined, and there's many definitions of determinism, but this is, I would argue, very arduently that this is the definition. It's the position that human choices, thoughts, and actions are determined by prior causes. So notice that I didn't say that the entire universe and absolutely everything is determined by prior causes. All that's necessary for free will to be an illusion or free will to be determined is that your choices, thoughts, and actions are determined by prior causes. Perhaps to a 100% degree, but that's basically the position of determinism. It gets confused with Newtonian fatalism quite a lot. Newton basically proposed that the universe is essentially a wound-up clock, and everything's just ticking. We're all connected. It's just everything is absolutely determined by something else. Of course, quantum mechanics has come along and threw a spanner at that. But if you actually evaluate quantum mechanics, it doesn't provide this scapegoat that a lot of people have brought to the table. But again, I'm getting well ahead of myself.
So in terms of like determinism, what would those prior causes be?
So those prior causes can be many things. So if we take, for example, let's try and get an example. Your choice to have a conversation, let's go back to the beginning, to be participating in this conversation. A determinist would argue that you didn't at any point consciously, with full autonomy, decide to have this conversation. It's entirely based on factors that are out of your control. First and foremost, you didn't choose to be born in this century where this is possible. You didn't choose to be born as a female. You didn't choose to be brought up in the area that you are in, to have access to the schools and knowledge that you had, to have the parents that you had, the family, the situation that's developed you as you are. You didn't choose to be inclined in a certain way, to have a certain amount of endorphins and oxytocin in order to find certain things interesting. It's just basically a determinist.
She didn't before becoming a YouTuber, like maybe there's other YouTubers that inspired you, but you didn't dictate the YouTube algorithm that showed the videos that got you interested in it.
Exactly. And like,
there's all these factors that,
And if you go further into it, it gets scary to realize just how determined everything is. For example, it could be, we could go a minute later on this conversation, and then I could pop out to the shop and nearly get ran over, or 10 seconds too late. And I could think to myself, well, shit, what if I ended it 10 seconds before? Would that have changed the outcome? Would I have been hit? The point is that it's all based on a deterministic factor, and that you don't have control over them. You don't have conscious autonomy over them, and therefore free will cannot be. It's false. Essentially, that's what the deterministic perspective would be.
When we do make changes to those things, so like you mentioned, like me not being in control of like the chemicals and hormones in my brain, but then when I'm like, okay, well, I have a deficit of like these hormones and stuff, and I go to the doctor and I start taking sertraline, and I'm making a conscious effort to change my brain chemistry. Does that still what is
the very fact that one, you're aware that drug exists, or that doctors are there to help you or something, and two, the fact that maybe you had a conversation with someone, or you saw an advertisement that like taught you that that's what you should do, or that's where you should go. That's something that was completely outside of your control. And then when you're sitting there thinking about it, like your likelihood on a scale of 1 to 100 of actually going to the doctor may be influenced by 1,000 factors. If let's say that particular day you're feeling really depressed and you don't want to get out of bed and you're lazy and you're exhausted, then like that is a factor that will, push you to not go to the doctor. But maybe you had a little bit of food already and your glucose levels are slightly higher, and you have more free will you have more willpower, not free will, but more willpower that day to get your butt out of bed. And then you're like, well, I'm already up, I already have my shoes on, I might as well go down to the doctor. Like there's all these factors that we're so unaware of just because there's of the sheer number of them.
But is it fair to equate like cause and effect to not having free will?
Fantastic question. So when it comes to determinism, the deterministic position doesn't say that you're not conscious. Okay. Consciousness isn't an illusion, according to determinists, and I don't think anyone could argue that it is. I think, therefore I am. What their position is that your consciousness, the idea that you are the author of your consciousness, that you really do make your decisions independent of prior causes, independent of basically being predetermined by the universe, by things that you don't have conscious control over. That's what is disputed. It doesn't dispute the fact that it ends up with you being conscious and having the illusion of free will. It just says that, or its proponents would say that because all of the determinants, your consciousness is completely predetermined by causes that you don't have conscious control over. Therefore, this libertarian notion of free will just isn't true. The evidence just isn't indicating it. And this is where it gets very interesting, because you can then redefine the word free will to fit for the examples that you just gave, without tying it to determinism. And here we enter compatibilism. So compatibilism is defined as the position that determinism and free will are compatible. So what it essentially argues is that free will doesn't require us to be in complete control of our actions, or as Arthur, I'm going to get this name wrong, Schopenhauer, is that right? As he put it, man can do what he wills, but he cannot will what he wills. And that kind of comes down to the position where you were just describing, and that is that it doesn't matter if it's determined, because we can define just consciously wanting to do something as free will, right? That makes sense, surely. So this is where things get even more interesting, and I promise you there's only so much I'm going to put on the table before we calm down a bit. But so let's get to the primary term, as you were reaching for previously, of free will. But let's approach it obliquely. How would you both define the word will?
Will is like, it's like a want to do something or a want to act.
Yeah, that works.
Urge or desire.
Exactly. So, I've got a simple definition here that I just wrote out, which is I basically see a will as someone's wants and desires that somebody wants to have actualized. That's all it is. It's simple, right? So a will does not require anything to do with determinism. It's just, it doesn't matter if you're determined. If you want to have this conversation, who gives a shit? If you chose to be interested in it, if you chose to have the specific food and nutrients in you for your mind to be functioning to have the conversation, it doesn't matter. As long as you chose it, well, that's Rachel's will, So, secondly, how would you both define free will?
See, this gets kind of tricky because it's like when you get into free will, it's like, yeah, there are so many factors that play into it. But like for example, let's say that you hold out two objects that are completely identical and completely equidistant from me. And you're like, pick one or the other. Well, statistically speaking, I'm going to be slightly more likely to pick the object on my right than on my left. And that's just across the board. But part of that, is because like I am so used to using my right hand. Like I'm right-handed. And so I have, I'm more likely to reach out with that, if both of my hands are free than with my left.
Yeah.
But is that something that I can change over the course of my life? Yeah, I could start using my left hand. I could become ambidextrous, I could consciously think about it, but I don't care to. Like, I have no desire to. I don't really, and in that regard, I don't really have free will. I feel like I have free autonomy.
Yep, absolutely.
But I don't think that would qualify as free will. As far as whether or not we have free will, I love the quote, do I believe that I have free will? Of course I do. I have no choice.
Exactly. Yeah. And there's no debate over that. I have heard Sam Harris before say that you can actually get over the illusion of having free will, but I'm not convinced of that because it just remains that the optical illusion always moves. You can't really get over it, kind of thing, especially with something as powerful an illusion as free will. But the definition of free will is where this all comes down to. So this libertarian definition of free will, which has persisted for thousands of years, and on top of that, this is why I would argue that the libertarian definition of free will is the definition of free will. The first is that there's thousands of years of conversations over it. And that is how it's been defined. That's how it's defined in pretty much every other area other than the philosophical domain of discourse, where compatibilism comes in and redefines it to basically mean will. But they call it free will because it's the freedom to do what you want. And the second is that everybody has this illusion. You don't have the illusion of having will, you have the illusion of having free will. You really do feel like you choose, think, and act voluntarily, that you are the author of yourself, that you have complete autonomy. It's an illusion, and even if it's not illusion, at least we can admit this is how we feel. I would assume you both agree that you do really feel like you're in control. You are driving the ship, right?
Most of the time. But what about the times when we've had our freedom taken away for whatever reason, like maybe someone's physically overpowered you, or maybe you've been locked away or something like that? Surely everyone knows that there are times when they don't have free will. Is that
okay? So no. All of these questions are really interesting. So in that case, you are being restrained. You're being imprisoned and restrained. But does that change the fact that you have autonomy over your mind? Like, you don't need to have or the feeling that you have complete autonomy over your mind. You don't have to be able to do whatever you want. You don't need to be able to fly in order to say that you've got free will, right? And that's an imprisonment that's put on us by the universe. Well, if you take another imprisonment, which is actually imprisonment, sure, you're in prison and you can't do anything like you want to do. You can't act upon your free will, but you still have the illusion that you have free will. You have you've chosen these desires and these acts. And you can choose. You feel like you can choose completely. It's up to you. Whether or not you want to sit there and be quiet, or whether or not you want to kick up a fuss and try and break the bars. So
I think that there needs to be a line drawn between, having complete control over your actions regardless of past influences. I think that's impossible because we're so influenced by our past and by our upbringing and by the just the nature of the universe, the laws of physics themselves. Like, they do create boundaries for in which we act. But I want to make a distinction between that and bodily autonomy. So, for example, there was an episode of, I think it's a White Rabbit, that has some of the Mythbusters crew where they'll try and test out different things, and in one of them they tried to come up with a way to have like mind control. And what they did was not mind control as far as what someone thinks, but as far as controlling their actions. And so they hooked up these electrodes to this person's arm and their brain and stuff, and they were able to, like, using your mind, like, cause them to, like, clench up or move a particular, like, send like a shock through their arm and make them like lift up their arm, like triggering the nerve endings. And so it's like, when you do that, it's like an overt action that shows that, like, hey, when I do this, you no longer have control over your muscles. You no longer have control over your arms. I do.
Yeah.
And so that's like robbing them of bodily autonomy.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a difference between bodily autonomy, the ability to move your body or control your mind. You know, it's like, unless, like, if you were to step in and give me a lobotomy or to damage different regions of my brain or electrocute different regions of my brain, you can actually control what I feel. You can control, you know, we're not precise enough to plant specific thoughts that way, but you know, then it's like you're losing your bodily autonomy, but the free will is different. That's like, you never had that to begin with. You felt like you were completely in control regardless of past circumstances, but the circumstances affect and influence your actions and inform your actions. And that's what we're saying you don't have any control over.
Essentially, yeah, that is basically, yeah. So, yeah, I mean, keep firing the questions, Rachel, by the way, if you have them. It's interesting. It's really good. I don't need to ask you. So despite the fact that, well, best way to go around this, most of history in this debate, with the specifically from the libertarian camp and religion in general, have argued that we are basically blank slates, and that things, while they might affect our decisions, they don't really affect our free will. It's still your choice to snap at someone, even if you didn't get enough sleep the night before, etc. But deep down, I would definitely argue that humanity's always really known that we're not completely autonomous. So a lack of sleep, food, or being ill profoundly affects the decisions that we freely make. And I say that in quote marks, of course. So I'm normally a calm person, I should say. However, a lack of sleep significantly reduces my fuse. I get angry much, much, much quicker, like to the point that I've noticed it very, very quickly. I'm wondering, have you guys noticed any factors such as sleep
I get
that profoundly affect you?
Well,
you get hangry.
Yeah, when I'm hungry. I'm the worst person to be around.
Can I point out real quick, Steve, that you know, you've mentioned religion almost as though, like, you know, most world religions will have a view of, like, you have libertarian free will, and I don't think it's that clear cut, because
it's not clear cut.
Even within different branches of Christianity, you have people who are determinists who believe that, you know, it's all predestined by a deity, and you have people who believe in fatalism, that the gods have predicted or ordained a particular path or outcome that you don't have any say over.
Absolutely.
So I don't think it is, you know, that religion really has, you know, you could be religious and be on either side of this question.
Okay, so let me explain why I colloquially referred to it as that is basically the religious position. So you have Calvinists, and you do have denominations in religions that see the world as determined, and they square that circle the way that they do. So that I'm not denying that at all. But if you take, for example, the vast majority of Christians, the vast majority of, in fact, almost all Muslims, and in fact, to a large extent, Jews as well, they operate on, basically, if you take heaven and hell, let's just use that for an example. I know that hell doesn't really exist in some denominations and some religions, but that's entirely based on decisions that you make. Reward and punishment when you die based on decisions that you make. That breaks down in the face of determinism. That really, really throws a spanner in it. It affects it profoundly. Whereas if you really are responsible for your actions, it doesn't matter if you were poorly treated as a child. If you end up hurting someone, you are entirely responsible for it. You entirely made that choice, rather than what the evidence now shows and what determinism has always basically suggested, and that is that factors of like a bad upbringing make bad people. It's not a surprise. Religions are based, a lot of the primary, what do I want to call them? Primary edicts and the primary foundation is built essentially on the assumption of free will. So another one would be Buddhism with reincarnation. That, depending on how well you act as an individual, so you personally, you will in your next life either basically receive an upgrade or a downgrade. That makes no sense if the world's completely determined. It doesn't make any sense at all. So that's why I was just saying that the libertarian position is almost synonymous with the religious position, because it is pretty much synonymous. Most people who are not religious in this day and age, and I do mean completely non-religious, they take either the determinism position or they take the compatibilist position. And that's because they focus on what you were saying earlier on, Rachel, where they say, well, actually, that's all that matters, that I get to choose what I want to, as long as I can act upon what I consciously want. Who gives a crap if it's determined? That's what free will is. That don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. That's what matters. And it's a fair argument to be had. I fall on the determinist position because I think that redefining the word isn't the right way to go around this. It'd rather just say that you've got will rather than free will. But that's essentially just to clear up what I was saying there, because you are right, Thomas. There are religions such as Calvinism that do have a deterministic factor.
I have another slight question. So this, I'm not quite sure the best way to express this, but remember back in like whichever, I think it was like episode 3 when we did What Makes You You.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how exactly does like that play into the idea of free will in terms of like, if a lot of things are like determined by outside factors and a lot of things are determined by things like, you know, brain chemistry and emotions that we can't control and things on like a sub or an unconscious level, then like at what point does it stop being free will and stop being determined by factors outside of who we are? Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, it does. For me, you are, actually what I said in the episode as well, you are your consciousness. You are who you are. The consciousness is what matters. You know, like technically we're made of billions or millions of microorganisms. And we could say, well, actually, we are a congregation. We are a nation of biological entities. And it's like, we are. But when I refer to somebody, it's their consciousness that I'm referring to. That's the person. So that's how I define what you are.
But what about like saying...
Well, when you start getting into that, like, you know, at what point, like what part of you is your consciousness, then you start getting into the hard problem of consciousness, which, you know, that's a whole nother episode.
It is a whole another episode. I don't think it's a problem at all. I think there's several things in philosophy which are put on stilts as if they're a really interesting question, and they're not. So another one is, if you push a tree down in a forest, if a tree falls in a forest and nobody is there to hear it fall, does it make a noise? Now that's a really interesting philosophical question, except it isn't. Like, to me, it's really not. It's based on incredible hubris, the assumption that unless you redefine the word sound, and again, this is my problem with compatibilism. It's like, let's talk about what's really being said here. Let's not redefine terms in order to make a certain statement be true. But that's just me. That's just my rant. You don't need to take that seriously, of course.
It does lead me on to another question, though, like, coming back to what I was saying before. So, like, let's say I have, like, this crazy emotional outburst that I have, like, no control over. It's just my emotions are just, like, all flowing out, and I slap you, right? I still have to, like, deal with the consequences of my action, but if I didn't consciously make the decision to slap you, then...
How can we punish you, right? Yeah, so this is why this is a really important question, because it completely destroys it doesn't destroy, but it really, really causes us to look at the foundations of our legal system and how crime and punishment is done. And it's actually a really good argument for rehabilitation rather than punishment, which is good because we know it works. And this is a thing that falls hand in hand with it. Sam Harris said something really important on the factor, because he was asked a similar question, and he said, if we could put earthquakes in prison, we would. It doesn't matter if it's conscious or not. So if you're an entity that is being belligerent and aggressive and hitting people, it depends. I mean, the example you gave, I'm sure I deserve the slap, but there may be an example where you do something erratic, and it's just bad. Well, yeah, you put them in prison. That might be the suitable response, and then give rehabilitation or whatever it might be. And there might be some things where it's like, sorry, that's just too far. That person has to be locked away for a very long time without any.
What about with pedophiles? They can't control their attraction to children, but they can control whether they act on it or not. So in that case, is punishment or rehabilitation the better option?
Well, if this is controversial, and tell me if I'm wrong here at all, but I've thought about this more than I should. I feel very, very, very bad for people that are attracted to children, but obviously they won't act on it because they know it's wrong, but they just don't get to choose that they're attracted to children. You were saying before that they basically grow up, a lot of them, they're attracted to the same age, and then as they get older, it doesn't change. Like, they're still attracted to that same age. I feel horrific for those. That's really sad. That's horrible. The answer isn't to punish them just because they think that way. It's to rehabilitate, and it's to have a dialogue with, and to appreciate that just is a fact. We're going to have to build around this and do the right thing around it.
Louis Theroux
at the same time though, you have to have some level of unless, like, let's say that we had that our neuroscientific capabilities just really take off, and that, you know, in 20 years we have a pill that cures pedophilia, or we're able to do some type of surgery that like fixes that urge or that desire, and just we're able to go in, pinpoint, all right, you're no longer attracted to children. Then in that case, yeah, you could make a really strong point that someone who is a pedophile, like, even if they have done something horrific, if they're not able to really if there is, you know, no free will, and it's a purely deterministic world, well, you could take that person and say, like, what is the likelihood that they'll commit a crime again? Well, we go in, we fix it, we make it so that they're no longer attracted to kids, and get rid of the illness, and you treat it as an illness. And then it's like, should they remain in jail for the rest of their life? Well, you know, I don't think that you know, putting people in jail for the rest of their life, if they're never ever going to commit a crime again, like, you know, that's where you start having the argument of like, well, should you still have punishment as a deterrent? Well,
punishment works as a deterrent. So, you know, it is. So, for example, you could rehabilitate that person, and you could be sure, let's say, hypothetically, that they are not going to offend again. Rationally, there's a good argument to say, okay, the person can be released. Emotionally, absolutely not. Like, even for me, it's just like, emotionally, I'm appalled by that. But I do understand that rationally that's the case. However, in the grand context of things, if there's a law that works very well by saying this is the punishment for doing something so heinous, you have to uphold that. And if that law just happens to reduce the crime rate on whatever it is or whatever it does, then sorry, even though they're rehabilitated, that's just the way the situation works. We're never really going to have the correct answer to how to deal with all of these things.
Let's say that the end game is to create a society with 0 instances of pedophilia and maximum well-being for all people. Well, you can argue that being in jail for some action that you committed based off of an urge or an impulse in your mind that you had no control over, that your well-being is diminished by being held in jail. You no longer have your freedom and autonomy to go out and do things. Now, at that point, it's like, you know, do I have sympathy for people who, you know, molest kids? Absolutely not. But at the same time, like, I do have sympathy for the fact that there's something that is damaged in their brain, that there's something that's going on there. And if you're able to fix that, then here's a question. Let's say that it's not pedophilia. Let's say that it is, you know, I steal $100 from you, and the judge tells me that I have to repay it and that I have to serve time. Well, once I get out of prison, you know, if I go and I do it again and I steal $100 from you, well, I'm probably going to face a slightly higher punishment now because I have a history, because I've done it before. So I might be put in jail for longer. And then if I keep doing it, you know, the crime is going to get longer because they're like, well, this guy, he has a history as a thief, and he's just going to keep doing it. But if they're able to fix that, if they're able to rehabilitate me, get rid of the urges to steal, get rid of, you know, my kleptomania, and there and maybe like fix the desperation, the desperate poverty that I'm living in, then if they can say beyond a shadow of a doubt that there's, right now there's like a 99% chance he's not going to commit a crime again, should I at that point be on a list of criminals for the rest of my life as someone who, like, this person, is suddenly on it's harder for me to get a job. It's, people don't want to associate with me. They don't trust me. Like, I don't think it's fair at that point. Once you fix the problem and rehabilitated the person, then, and I'm not saying that we're at the point where it's just that easy to fix stuff, because our brain chemistry is so much more complicated than we realize.
No, it's a hypothetical, of course.
But it does make a strong case for finding better ways to rehabilitate and to fix the problem at its root, rather than just punishing people for, extended periods of time and just taking them out of society so that they don't recommit a crime.
Well, this is partly why people, I don't think the mass, one of the reasons why a lot of people haven't taken, especially the studies I'm about to give you guys, seriously. And that is because the ramifications that it has is enormous. We can't even have the conversation that you've just brought up, at least not politically, because people are not recognizing just how much of our actions are determined by prior causes. And that causes a lot of harm, a hell of a lot of harm. So to answer your question, or to dodge your question, to be more accurate, I don't know the answer, but I want to have intellectual conversations about it, but it can't happen until we get past this first hurdling block. So a lot of people do just jump to, well, there's got to be some punishment. And it's like, well, it depends on what you mean by punishment, of course. And it depends on the context of what's happening, and each case is its own. And do we actually have the resources to deal with it as it is, or do we have to deal with it with blanket assumptions, etc.? It's quite difficult.
Yeah.
But here's a story which I absolutely love. I may have told you guys before, but if I haven't, this is just awesome. I love it. So, in relation to how external factors affect us, one of my favorite facts is that in 1999, the celebrated master of lateral thinking, Edward de Bono, you might know about him, Rachel, from marketing, he was asked by the British Foreign Office to come up with a solution to the Arab-Israeli conflict in the Middle East. And to their astonishment, he handed them a jar of Marmite. So why would you think he would pass Marmite to them? It's bizarre, isn't it? It's like that was his response.
I guess.
I'm guessing it's like sit down and have tea together or something. I don't know. Like, Marmite's a British thing. I don't know your weird customs.
I guess maybe something to do with, like, giving them something else to disagree over or agree over, or I'm not sure. Finding
that's a good
ground.
point. I like that.
Know.
I didn't think of that, but that's good because of the half like it, half hate it. Okay, so
is Marmite is British and Vegemite is Australian, or which one is?
Yeah, we got Marmite, I think.
You guys are weird.
Yeah.
Oh, Marmite is grim though. Oh.
I quite like it.
Get off the
but
podcast.
It is a. I know. All right, bye guys. So here's his reasoning. It's great. He said, since studies show that the average person living in the affected region has a zinc deficiency, and since a lack of zinc causes irritability, the way to resolve their conflict is to send them endless supplies of zinc-rich products, such as Marmite.
Huh.
That's genius. To me, it's
cool.
really thinking smartly, and it really illustrates that he understands that external factors that we are mostly unaware of, and over which we have pretty much no conscious control unless we are aware of them, at least in part determine our consciousness, which in turn determines our decisions. So really potent observation for me anyway. I just thought it was absolutely brilliant.
I like that.
There's an incredible book on this topic by R. Douglas Fields called Why We Snap, Understanding the Rage Circuit in the Brain. And he walks through all of the different triggers that cause people to react in a hostile, negative way. Like, and he first goes through and he looks at like different case studies of people who like are otherwise like the most peaceful, like never ever would like hurt a fly in their entire life. And then all of a sudden there's just out of nowhere, nobody expects it, and they just go like crazy rampage, like just someone like cuts them off in traffic and they just like, pull them out of their car and just like beat them to death or something like that. And it's like, whoa, like where did this come from? And like in these specific cases, he puts forth this, what do you call it? When you have the first letter of everything stands for something.
An
acronym.
An acronym where he has like the life morts triggers, where like the L stands for like if you feel like your personal life is threatened. So like if someone puts a gun to you and you think you're about to die, you might like react violently and kill them or something, or like lash out. And then like each one stands for different things, but like one of them is like, I think that the M is like your mate. Like if someone who is attacking like your spouse or someone that, you know, is your mate, that like you're going to be more likely to react violently. Or if you feel like your status or your place in society is threatened, or if you feel like your like income, your source of like food to like sustain you and whatnot is threatened, like your territory, your family, you know, all of these things, you know, your kids and stuff. Like if you feel like a specific one is under threat, that can trigger this just instant like rage reaction. And when you have like a higher, or like throughout the day, your threshold for snapping is going to be higher or lower based off of certain things. So like let's say that you just got a really good night's sleep and you've been meditating and you're stress free and you just like you have plenty of food and you're just like life is good, and all of a sudden someone cuts you off in traffic. Well, you're much more likely to be able to blow that off than if, let's say that you've been arguing with your spouse for weeks and your marriage is on the rocks, and you know, you haven't eaten anything all morning and you got like 2 hours of sleep the night before and you're running late to work and you feel like you're about to lose your job, and all of a sudden this guy cuts in front of you. And when he cuts in front of you in traffic, he sets off several triggers. One, you feel like your life is threatened because you're driving in basically a metal bomb filled with gasoline.
Yeah.
And two, you feel like, you know, he cut you off and you're going to hit a red light, and then you're going to be several minutes late to work and your boss is going to fire you because you've been late several times before. So that's like threatening your you know, sustenance, your income, your source of well-being. Also, you feel personally insulted. The I in the acronym stands for like, I think it's insult.
Yeah.
You know, you feel personally insulted. And even though that doesn't, you know, nobody is standing around going like, you know, well, most of the time, you know, when you're driving alone, no one's like, haha, he cut you off. Like, you're not going to let him do that. You know, you're just like a little cuck sitting over there letting someone like walk all over you like that. You know, you're not getting, even though you don't have that in that situation, it still triggers that response in your brain where, you know, you just feel, without even realizing why you feel that way, you feel personally insulted, and like it's going to affect your place and your stance in society. And so we're kind of ingrained with this reaction, this visceral, guttural reaction to lash out at people who do that. So like, one, just understanding that like there's different thresholds at which point you can snap, and two, like what are those triggers that I need to look out for and be aware of, to, even though I instantly get kind of this urge, this angry reaction, you can, through consciously, like beforehand, kind of understanding why we snap, understanding what the triggers are, and noticing them and being aware of them in the moment when they come up, you can have some control over it to be like, all right, well, does this make sense? Like, what can I do to kind of take a step back, take some deep breaths, maybe get some food, increase my glucose levels, have zinc or whatever in my diet, you know, like meditate. Like there are steps that you can take. But as far as determinism goes, just me telling our listeners about this now, or our two listeners, I think we have two now.
We probably got two, I reckon, yeah. Hi, guys.
By telling them about this, by informing them about this, then suddenly they're more able to take it into account and to be able to deal with some of the rage that may be triggered otherwise. And did they have any free will over whether or not I was going to say this? No. Like, so we're kind of back to the determinist stance, but that doesn't mean that there aren't things that you can do or actions that you can take to try to control or prevent, you know, lashing out like an animal to overcome some of the animalistic tendencies.
Exactly. You're a conscious agent with will, and ultimately you are determined by prior causes. Whether or not those causes are determined is irrelevant. So just in case somebody's thinking quantum mechanics and not knowing where certain particles are, and one, it doesn't actually say that the world is non-deterministic. It really doesn't. It's worth looking up. I've done a video on it because I thought, wow, that's interesting. But two, even if that was the case, even if your interests, for example, were completely, or maybe not your interests, go further down, like your biological urges deep in the subconscious, even if they were completely autonomous. There was no prior cause that caused them to be the way that they are. It doesn't, as long as they are the things that inform your consciousness, there is, as far as I'm concerned, there's no free will. So for me, it's, if your conscious choices are determined by prior desires and interests that you didn't choose, you don't have free will. You have will, and I think that's all that matters. And we can have a functional society, said society weirdly there, but we can have a functional society, and we can answer really interesting questions once that's kind of taken. So I want to share with you guys 2 studies that are they're just brilliant, and I want to hear what your thoughts are, whether or not you get the same. You have the same response as I do. So, over the last 30 years, neuroscience has progressively played a larger role in this question, and that's probably no surprise. So here's just a few studies. In 1983, Benjamin Libet conducted a study in which he wired subjects to an EEG machine to measure their brain activity. He then put a timer in front of them, asked them to consciously decide to perform a hand movement, and then reported the exact time that they had made a conscious decision. So pretty simple things, right? Simple study. Well, the results were extremely fascinating, and this is 1983. He found, and I quote, the onset of cerebral activity clearly preceded by at least several hundred milliseconds the reported time of conscious intention to act. Or in other words, that the subject's brain had initiated the movement long before the subject had consciously made a decision. That's pretty damning. Like you think that you've made a conscious decision and then you act, and yet you're wired up to a machine in 1983, and the person can, more often than not, tell you they know what you're going to do before you've consciously made the decision because they are scanning your brain.
It's interesting, but I'd like to hear a little bit more about the study. For example, like what the context was, like where they were, who else was in the room, and if there were any factors like I don't know, like maybe they picked up on someone moving, or there was some kind of trigger that triggered that subconscious brain activity before they made the decision. So it's interesting, but I'd like to hear a bit more about it.
In this case, they were isolated in the room.
They were isolated.
And what it showed was, like, wasn't it like they looked at the clock, they saw, the exact time it was, and then they decided to move their hand. And then they said what time they made the decision. But what they found was that they actually started, like, there was an emotional decision. They started moving their hand before they were even conscious of it.
Okay.
Basically, by reading the...
It showed that the order was in the reverse of what we thought.
So it could be that they had, like, a subconscious sort of emotional reaction to the number, or something like that, maybe. Is that...
Yeah,
well, it was like there was an emotional response before we were conscious of the choice.
Yeah.
So, like, they were still choosing to move their hand, but they weren't conscious of the choice until after they'd made the motion.
That's it. So, they had made the choice unconsciously before they knew that they had made it consciously. If we refer to they as them, the brain, the physiological body that they manifest. And what's so interesting there is that that's not how we think we work. That's not how we have the illusion of us working. So the fact that emotionally, in the brain, subconsciously, you have made a decision, for example, to have a drink before you consciously decide to drink. That is a ridiculous discovery, and it's been repeated over and over. And to me, it doesn't ruin free will or anything. The next one does, which I'll tell you, but it is really interesting.
So, sorry, I know this is like a little bit repetitive. So are we saying that, like, if we have free will, it means that we have conscious sort of choice over all of our actions?
It's more that you are basically the ghost in the machine.
Okay.
It's more that you at least have some conscious control over your action. At least some of your action is completely developed in your consciousness, like from scratch. Like at least some of it is autonomous. It doesn't need to be all of it, because like we said, we are informed by things. But is it that we are just completely our complete consciousness is the product of previous events?
But this study is showing even the decisions we think are conscious are actually unconscious.
Exactly. It shows that they are made unconsciously before we've made them consciously. And the big spanner that it throws in the work for free will, and specifically the libertarian sense of free will, is that can't be the case for libertarian free will to be true. Yeah. But there was a lot of people that jumped on the methodology, as you did, and rightfully so. That's the first thing to question. And they had problems with it as well. They said, well, actually, we didn't get an indication of a choice. What we got was that
just
before
activity.
somebody exactly, before someone chooses to activate, you can tell that they're about to activate. Like, that decision's made beforehand. And to be honest with you, I don't think that criticism undermines the crux of what's being conveyed, but a lot of people did, and so a lot of other tests have been conducted. This one's bizarre. So in 2008, Chung Sion-soon conducted a similar experiment using an fMRI, said it right this time, guys, machine, in which he asked subjects to freely choose between and then immediately press one of two buttons that were operated by the subject's left and right index fingers. So you can see how the methodology was basically making up for the primary criticism of Lebet's. So his results were insane. So he found, and to quote, the outcome of a decision can be encoded in brain activity of prefrontal and parietal cortex up to 10 seconds before it enters awareness. And he added that the delay presumably reflects the operation of a network of high-level control areas before a decision is made. So that's a crazy study. Like, if you're wired up, and I say, like, exactly what he said, you're wired up to an fMRI machine, and I basically say, here's your left index finger, here's your right, there's a button underneath them. Can you think about it for a while? And then once you have consciously decided that's the one I want, then press it immediately. So you go, that's the one I want, go for it.
Did this happen when the person was choosing to use their like non-dominant finger, if that makes sense? Because like imagine like index fingers, right? Most people probably use their right index finger for like mouse clicking and stuff. So there's probably like a really, really like fast neural pathway there to kind of like have an instinctual click with that. Did that make a difference? Like which finger they chose?
So it's been a while since I've read the study, but so far as I understand, that part was eliminated from it, because if you take impulse actions, you're right, you're going to use your dominant hand, or there's neurological pathways which you're naturally going to go to. But when you're sat there and they're saying think about it, you've probably got more chance of still using your dominant hand. But the fact that using the machine, they can tell 10 seconds before. I think the accuracy was about 85%. This is really rudimentary tools that we still have, by the way, and yet we could tell with about an 85% certainty which one you were going to press up to 10 seconds before you knew what you were going to do.
That's really interesting.
That is a wrecking ball.
That's really cool.
to the conventional thoughts, the illusion that we really are, the ghost in the machine. We are at the wheel. We're not like that. At least to me, I find that study really hard to square. But
so my next question is: if we can like predict these things, does it mean that all behavior in people, in humans, is predictable?
It's a bit like I think it's Laplace's demon. If we had all the factors and we knew everything, then yes, you would be able to predict pretty much everything. But even if that wasn't the case, even if it was that you can't actually predict everything because there is some factors within the universe that are not deterministic, it might be in the quantum world, whatever it might be. All that's necessary for free will to be an illusion is that your consciousness is predetermined. Okay. And so far as those studies have proven, to me at least, or the evidence is substantially put its weight on, I don't think there's a question to be had anymore. Like, we just got to get on with that fact and to work around it. And there's many ways we can do it, but in my opinion, it just means that free will is an illusion. I mean, we are conscious, of course we are, and we have a will, of course we do. But the idea, the feeling that we have that we are the authors, I don't think it's the case. But I don't want to preach too much because I'm pretty convinced
So
on it.
what
I hope I
about
don't come off that way.
Sorry, I know I'm asking a lot of questions.
No, you go for it. Absolutely.
What about in cases like where people go through like cognitive behavioral therapy to try and change their like natural instincts and natural reactions? People are like consciously trying to change what they are, so they're trying to change their subconscious reactions. Like, does that still like what does that mean for free will?
Yeah, sure. So you're aware of it. So let's take something a little bit less complicated, but it falls into the same area. I recognize that I became more belligerent, for lack of a better word, when I was lacking sleep. Now, as soon as I made that conscious realization, which is basically what cognitive therapy is, it's getting you to realize what is triggering what and how you can act to either fix it or prevent it or whatever the solution might be. The fact that I consciously realized that that's a factor that determines what I am, and then I chose, keyword chose, to make sure that I get more sleep. The decision itself to get more sleep is determined by prior causes. It becomes like an inception.
Okay.
So the fact that we act upon this knowledge doesn't allow us to escape the fact that we're in it. It reminds me of a quote that Sam Harris puts when he's conveying and conversing about similar questions. He says, "You are not controlling the storm, and you are not lost in it. You are the storm." And it's really hard to. It's like you're in the frame, you're in the picture, and you have no choice but to be in the picture. But the evidence is showing you that there's a frame, and you can't see the frame, but it is the case.
Yeah.
Like there's just so much evidence for it, but you have no choice but to experience it as being in the picture.
But then what?
And it's like you still have, like let's say that you choose to get sleep. Your choice will affect your future decisions. So like tomorrow you may be, a better person, when it comes to people don't want to deal with you when you're grumpy and angry and bitter and whatnot. But when you're well rested, then, that could positively impact your friendships and your work and all kinds of other stuff. And so the choice that you make, like you may not have free will so much based off of like whether or not you've slept, but you had the choice to choose whether you slept or not, but you didn't necessarily have the free will to decide that, why you were choosing that you wanted to sleep. But it's still your actions are still affecting it because as a whole, you care about your place in society. You don't want to experience pain. You don't want to be in a prison. You don't want to be living on the street. And so, you may not have free will in that regard, but at least it's working to your advantage.
Just to capitalize on that, actually, something that Dan Dennett says. Dan Dennett's a compatibilist, but this statement is brilliant. He says, you don't have free will. Basically, you just don't. The evidence is very clear, but you have the freedom that matters, and that is that you are a conscious agent that has desires, that has a will, and you base your lives on that. You have the illusion that you're free, but the freedom that actually matters is that you can pursue and you can do what you want to do. That's all that matters, and you're doing it without hurting other entities. So that's all that matters.
And here's the cool thing too. If let's say that someone is sitting in and they're like, well, if I don't have free will, why even bother getting out of bed? I'm like, well, let's say that you decide to get out of bed and then you decide to go and, you go to like some rally or something to fight for civil rights for other people or something. And maybe you give a speech that stirs up in people like this desire to make the world better for everyone. Well, technically, maybe you didn't have free will to do that, but then you did that and that affected other people's actions. They didn't have free will over it, but you're still affecting like what outcome they take.
Yep.
And it's like, maybe by me saying this, it encourages someone to get off their ass and to do something. Do they technically have free will? Maybe, but it's a technicality. I don't think it really matters when in our day-to-day life of like, I want to make the world better. I want to live in a better world. I think a lot of people want that too. And I don't think that the will has to be entirely free for us to still have those desires and that to have that will and to really push for it.
Yeah, no, definitely. Will is all that matters. It really does. Like this idea that free will actually matters, it doesn't. But the fact, once you admit that free will really isn't something that we have, the evidence is really quite overwhelming at this point. When you make the observation, it does have ramifications on particularly the legal system, etc. And these are things that we need to embrace. Also, just to add to what you're saying, actually, if you've ever tried laying in bed and just going, I'm not getting out of bed, That's a choice, and it's a really hard choice to keep as the time goes on. It's like people go, "Oh, I'll just do that." It's like you won't. You'll end up wanting to get out of bed, and guess what? The reasons you want to get out of bed are not your choice. That's the irony of it, you know.
You don't want all of your muscles to atrophy,
exactly.
And for your stomach to shrink and you starve and have to go to the bathroom.
And then you get depressed because you're not moving, and this is really important. You know, it's just
sunlight.
Exactly. You're in this game. You don't get to choose to sit out, but the game isn't what you think it is.
So would you say that even if all of our actions and decisions are kind of predetermined, that doesn't make the future already determined?
Okay. So this is a good question. So some people would maintain, and they would say that everything in the universe is determined, and therefore you've basically got what is Newtonian's celestial clock. Yeah. That is that the future is absolutely determined. So if you had all the factors, if you knew all of the deterministic factors now, you could accurately predict with 100% accuracy the future. I don't go so far as to say, and determinists don't in general, don't go so far as to say that we know that, because in order to know that, you kind of need to know everything. It's ridiculous. Rather, all they say is that human consciousness is determined. It's a much more humble claim, and that's all that's necessary. It's not necessary to make this assertion that everything's determined, and therefore we do have an ultimate future which is determined itself. Ultimately, I don't know the answer to that. I personally suspect it's probably true, but I haven't got enough evidence to believe it with fervence. It's just I personally suspect that it's true. Another thing that I personally suspect is that the universe is eternal, despite what Einstein and a few other scientific theories indicate. I just suspect that it's eternal.
Can I say something that, like, it may sound slightly nefarious just because, like, the term social engineering or human hacking kind of has a bit of a negative connotation involved. But when you really think of the world in terms of determinism, then it may be a little bit disheartening because you're like, oh, I don't have complete free will over all of the influences in my life. But at the same time, you think about it, you're like, okay, if everyone's actions are based off of, you know, all of the inputs that they've had up until that point, and you're able to come about a conversation or an approach with one of two different ways or one of multiple different approaches, and you're able to influence their reaction based off of the inputs that you provide, that is extremely empowering, that concept. Because if I come up to you and I want to convince you to take a particular course of action, it could be nefarious. It could be, I want to con you into giving me $200 and I'm going to make off with all your money and I'm going to, you know, screw you over. Or it could be really positive. It could be, I want to get you behind this particular cause to fight global warming or to end poverty or suffering. And when you know that, when you go into it from that approach, then you can actually study psychology and learn different marketing techniques and tactics that get a better response from people. That's not evil in and of itself. Like, how you go about it can be good or bad, but it's extremely empowering knowing that, like, hey, well, what if I ask for a tiny favor first, then I have a foot in the door, and then you're more likely to say yes to something down the road. Or if I, you know, let's say that I put out 20 samples, you're less likely to buy them than if I put out like 2 or 3. You know, you start learning these different things that it's like, does the person who you're engaging with really have complete control over their choices? Well, you don't have complete control to sway their decisions, but you can increase your odds. You can increase it statistically by being either friendly and approachable or like hostile, angry, telling them that they have to do something. You know, should you invoke, you know, rage and anger and emotions? Should you give them facts? Should you use a kind of a combination of the two? You know, that's really empowering when you start to realize that, like, you actually do have an influence on other people's actions. Not complete control, but you have a very strong influence, and the way that you go about it can be more or less influential.
What you were saying about choice, by the way, one of the things that I learned in marketing is that marketing basically is the act of being conscious of how the human brain works and being able to exploit it because of that consciousness. So when it comes to plane tickets, companies were trying to sell plane tickets and they were trying to sell second class. Everyone went for third class. So they're like, well, this sucks. What can we do? They had second class and third class. That's all they had, and everyone was going for second. Well, somebody understanding how the human mind works, and bear in mind, the people that are buying the tickets, they're consciously buying the tickets. They make a decision. For them, it feels like free will. The marketers said, right, let's add another tier, which will be first class, second class, third class. And the amount of people that jumped up to second class is insane. And it's because people just wanted to take the middle ground. It's just a psychological aspect that we have built into us. And that is an example of somebody manipulating the conscious choice of someone without those people realizing that they've been manipulated or duped at all. And it just falls down into the fact that they just understand your subconsciousness better than you do, and so they can exploit you to that manner. That's basically what a lot of tricks and illusionists do. It's just they understand this better than you.
Have you read Predictably Irrational by Dan? I think it's Dan Ariely. I think that's how you say his name.
Dan Ariely.
Yeah.
Very good book. Very good book.
That touches on loads of things like this, and how
like the power of the default is big. Yeah. I think it was it in the Netherlands where they were trying to get more people to be organ donors, and initially you had to opt in.
Yep.
And nobody was opting in. It was like maybe 5%, even when they tried to stress it. And then they're like, well, what if we change it? What if we still give people an option? But by default, we have it checked as, if in the case of my demise, like I want to be an organ donor. But if you don't want to, then you opt out. And they found that it switched. It was suddenly like 95% of people were in and only like 5% opted out. And because people are just inherently lazy. They're not going to take that extra step.
No, it's even more than that. It's not just the laziness. It's, if you look at the first one, the psychology of it, you have to go out of your way and say, I want to donate my organs. The other way round, you have to go out your way to say, when I die, I want you to just bury me or cremate me. I don't want you to utilize my body to potentially save someone else.
The first one is like saying, I want to help people. The second one is saying, I don't want to help people.
And there's a neutral position on the first one where you can just go, I'm just not interested. And that does come into it. And also, well, I don't really want to do it because I kind of want my body just to be buried or whatever. But the position is just neutral. Whereas with the flip,
one's like consciously saying, I'm a monster.
Yeah, exactly. So the flip of it that works. And all of a sudden there's conscious decisions being reduced or made. And people think, oh, I'm making these decisions. You're not. These people, they're just understanding you better. My favorite one is commitment and consistency with charities. I know I've said it before, but it's absolutely worth saying again. Somebody comes up to you and says, hey, we are doing a charity for dogs that were abused. Would you mind donating as much as maybe £5 a month? I'd really appreciate it. And you could give these dogs new homes. You get a certain amount of people that will do it, and most people won't. But if you go up to them and say, hey, can you sign this petition? We're against people abusing dogs. And then once they've signed it, you give them the same pictures the first time. You then pull out the other thing. You go, would you mind donating maybe £5 a month towards this cause? The amount of people that will follow you, that will give you money for that cause, is astronomically higher. And the reason is because of the commitment and consistency heuristic. They have just publicly stated by signing that thing beforehand that they are against the abuse of dogs. And then you ask for their money and they want to be consistent. It's a really important thing for humans. Now, most people don't realize that that's what's actually happening at the subconscious. And there you go. It transfers. It's amazing.
There was a similar experiment where some marketers asked before giving any kind of pitch, they just ask, do you mind if we just leave this sign in your front yard? And they left it there for a month, and then they came back and they're like, oh, thank you so much for supporting our cause and for leaving the sign in the yard. I was wondering maybe I could tell you more about it. And the response rates, people, they already had kind of a foot in the door, and they're like, oh yeah, of course, sure, come in, because I've already given you something I must like you.
Yeah.
There's this post-rationalization that goes on in our minds as to why we did something.
There's a thing, isn't there, where if you want someone to do you a favor, ask them for something small, like a pen first.
Churchill did it all the time. He even admitted it. He said that he just asked for a little favor. He'd have 4 pens in his pocket, and he'd just say to someone, would you mind getting me that pen, good sir? He'd get him the pen, and the reason is because of that rapport that's being built psychologically. Because all of a sudden, I must like this guy. I've done something for him. So
I think that's the Benjamin Franklin effect, where Benjamin Franklin historically had kind of a rival enemy, this guy that really didn't like him. And so he wrote to him and he asked him for a favor. And he's like, hey, I heard that you had this book in your library and I was really wondering if I could borrow it from you. Like, I really appreciate it. And like the guy's, something small that was completely unrelated. And the guy's like, oh, okay, sure. And then after that point, like he kind of, it was almost like he was rationalizing after the fact. Why did I help him? Why was I nice to him? Oh, I must like him. He must not be that bad.
Yeah.
And as a result, like from that moment on, like they never had any issues or difficulties with each other. And it's not that that's always, the easiest fix, but it is interesting to show that like there's a lot of stuff subconsciously, even like in hotels. Like one experiment found that like people were much more likely to reuse their towels rather than asking for cleaning services, which cut down on the hotel cost and the amount of like water waste and stuff.
Yep.
If they different signs, how they worded them, and like some of them were just like, please reuse your towel, and like nobody did. Another one was like, please reuse your towel, it'll help the environment. Like a few more people did. And then they did like 70% of people who stay in this hotel room reuse their towel to help the environment.
Yep.
And all of a sudden, like the rates just like shot through the roof of people who were like,
Exactly. And the more that we know about these psychological factors, about how the mind works, the more we know about neurology specifically, the more we know about how the universe works. And all of this, even though we know a lot, we know very little. We really do. It's hard for us to comprehend that fact because we have nothing to compare it to. We are the smartest species we know of. But don't let that fool you into thinking that we're smart. We're not. You really... it depends on how you define it, but we have a rudimentary understanding of most things. And yet, even with that rudimentary understanding, the evidence is showing very clearly that we are not special. I'm sorry, that's what it's showing. We are a power-seeking primate. We're a mammal, and we are determined just like all of nature. That is what it's showing. That sounds like a grim story when it's put to certain alternatives, but it's not. It doesn't need to be. Like there is, as Darwin said, there is grandeur in this view of life, and I always want to get that across to people, because when I first started delving into topics like this, I felt not depressed, but I had existential concern, because to me, at least, like, as you said earlier, this doesn't necessarily throw anything into existential spin, but it did for me. So I just wanted to
I'm kind of getting those vibes.
Yeah, well, it's a fascinating topic, and we will discuss it again, either on the podcast or just in general, because it's great.
I guess a last question I'd have is like, what does this mean for sort of randomness, if that makes sense? Like, does randomness exist? Can anything be random, or is it all predetermined, even down to like I don't know, like a cell mutation?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Okay, so when it comes to free will, even if randomness exists, it's irrelevant. Okay. I just want to get that point across, because it doesn't matter if the factors that cause you to act in a certain way, cause you to consciously think in a certain way. It doesn't matter if they're random. All that matters in the context of free will is that your consciousness is predetermined by prior causes. Okay. Like, if there's any point I want to get across, I think it's that. But as for whether or not, if the universe really is deterministic, as I personally suspect it is, but I don't have enough evidence for it, of course, it means that randomness doesn't exist. Randomness is you not knowing what the trajectory is. That's basically what it is. That's all it is.
Well, can I chime in here too? For you always get like the new age person who's like, oh, well, what about the quantum level and the quantum randomness, and it can account for conscious free will, right? And like the fact is, first of all, no. Like the when you actually understand the scales of like how astronomically tiny the stuff that's going on in the quantum level is, and like then you actually scale it way up to like the cells that are actually affecting like our brain chemistry and our responses, and like how massively like huge it has to be before it starts affecting us. Like, it just doesn't work. But second, even if it did, even if there is some level of randomness that's affecting our neurochemistry to make us behave in a particular way, then that's still not free will, is it? It's randomness. It's random behavior, random actions. Exactly. It's not conscious, deliberated thought. It's there's just random little fluctuations that are going on.
That's great. Like, if your consciousness is determined by randomness or by deterministic factors, neither of which give you free will. Neither of which. Free will requires a real autonomy, and the evidence is just lacking for it, and the more we know it, it reduces. I just wanted to leave basically, essentially, nearly at least conclude with a quote from Sam Harris in regards to the studies that I was mentioning, and a couple more. He said, "One fact now seems indisputable. Some moments before you are aware of what you will do next, a time in which you subjectively appear to have complete freedom to behave however you please, your brain has already determined what you will do. You then become conscious of this decision and believe that you are in the process of making it." I just think it just encapsulates exactly what these studies are finding, and it's just very interesting.
It's insane. You kind of, I know you joked earlier that you were going to like blow my mind, but you kind of have. I am seeing things in like a whole different light.
If you keep thinking about it,
that's the whole point of this podcast.
Yeah,
right?
Woo! Yeah, let us know if this has blown your mind.
So we are running close to being out of time. But go ahead and continue your thought, and then I kind of want to ask, like, well, where do we go from here? How do we use this to make a better world?
Absolutely.
And how can it get me more puppies?
Mm-hmm. How can it get
But Steve, you're about to say something.
No, I basically just wanted to. That's essentially where I'm happy to conclude. But you're absolutely right. Let's tie this into how we can use this. So the way I would use it is that, first of all, it needs to be recognised for what it is. The world just hasn't recognised these studies, and that either means that I'm being obtuse and I'm not seeing something here, or it just means that we're not interested. It could mean that
it could be out of fear.
It could be fear. It is not a nice thing to know. Even for atheists, most atheists believe in free will, and it's just like, oh wow, that changes things. Again, thank you. It's always best to recognize reality for what it is, because that's when we can actually respond to it justly. So this whole progress with rehabilitation, it is basically the it's the observation that people are predetermined by factors, and that we can basically hardwire people to not be that way by addressing what's made them that way. And realizing that free will is an illusion just allows us to go the step further and to really ask interesting questions and to really create a healthy society. I don't think that you can have I don't think we can make a society that is utopian for our well-being, let alone the well-being of all sentient entities, without recognizing this fact. It's that important. So that's where I think the contribution comes in to how we can make the world a better place, by first of all acknowledging it and then having the interesting conversations.
Yeah, especially in the realm of punitive versus rehabilitative justice. Finding, imagine if we did have a world where we really could understand the brain chemistry to the point where if someone is a psychopath, and an excellent example that I would like to give is there was a case where there was this guy, he was a family man, and he didn't have any urges whatsoever, any I think it was, in this case, it was pedophilia.
It was.
Where Crash Course did a video on this where they talked about it. And all of a sudden, he started having these crazy sexual urges and stuff. And they found that right when this happened, like, they scanned his brain and they found that he had a brain tumor. They removed the tumor and the urges went away. And then afterwards he had, they came back and they found that a brain tumor was there again in the same spot. And so, like, if all of our urges, our desires, I've talked before about how, like, if you have a smaller than average amygdala or damaged connections, or if it's functioning improperly, then you can have a higher likelihood to be psychopathic. Like, if all of this stuff is emerging from your brain, then I think the onus is on us to help those people, to find ways to help fix what is going on in their brain, rather than just like put them through some form of cruel or unusual punishment or punitive punishment that just prevents others from doing it, because you're not fixing the problem. You're not getting to the root of why they're doing what they're doing.
It goes back to that saying, if you want to fix something, the first step is to acknowledge it.
Yeah.
And the way that you fix these things is actually acknowledging its foundation. And its foundation is that the illusion that we all have is not quite right. So yeah, that's basically how it can be put in. So for everyone listening, like, let us know if you found this topic interesting, and whether or not I've missed something, whether or not we've missed something in general, whether or not you feel like I've misrepresented certain positions. I'm very interested. And join us next week, where it will be Thomas, I believe. Is that right, Thomas?
Yes. I want to talk about I want to take this a step further, this conversation of do we have free will? And I want to talk more about mind-body dualism. Ooh. Are we, is the mind Excellent. A construct of the brain?
Excellent. Awesome. Wow. Well,
that sounds really good.
I think people can gather where I'm going to fall on that one, but yeah, that sounds very interesting. So join us for that. As always, thank you for the view. If you could rate us, drink the Kool-Aid, exactly.
And my name is Rachel.
And my dog is beautiful.
She is.
Oh, by the way, Rachel, congratulations on the new dog.
Thank you.
Yes,
nice
congratulations.
Okay.
Anyways, I think Steve, you were wrapping us out, so we don't really have a tagline.
Well, I will just leave it with that quote from Sam Harris again, which is, "You are not controlling the storm. You are not lost in it. You are the storm." And that's about like everyone's like, "I am the storm."
Right, I am the storm in the comments if you made it to the end.
I think it's a little bit better
No
than,
one will do it.
Put your poo in me.
That was one hell of a quote. After that,
I'm just thinking that
you know you get. That's our tagline. Yeah, put your poo in me.
Discover the past, create the future. Put your poo in me.
I'm gonna do one of those quotes, you know, like when you get like it's black and it's got like a nice sans serif font, half of it's filled with a black and white picture of Thomas being serious, and the quote just says exactly what you just said. Put your poo in me.
Can we get it on
No, now people are gonna make memes about it. All of my work with Holy Kool-Aid and with the show is going to be forgotten, and I'm only going to be known as the Put Your Poo in Me guy.
Oh my! But do you know what? You had no choice but to say that.
I know. This has been an absolute blast, and now we want you to join in the conversation over on the Here and How Facebook and Twitter pages, or follow us on Pinterest and Instagram if you just want some of the dankest of science-y memes. If you like one of our particular styles, check out each of our YouTube channels: Rachel Oates, Rationality Rules by Stephen Woodford, and Holy Kool-Aid by me, Thomas Westbrook. To find all of our episodes, show notes, contact information, and more, warp on over to our home base, thehereandhow.com. If you enjoyed this episode and want us to succeed in spreading the love of science, you can help us out by giving us a 5-star review on iTunes or Stitcher. And to all our friends and family listening, thank you for spending this episode with us. We'll be back to explore another exciting big idea next week. Now go create something magnificent.